Okay, maybe we can begin as more people do join in as we progress. So, welcome everybody to this 22nd research webinar from CMI, all based on CMI's Consumer Pyramids Household Survey and the CPDX data that corresponds to that. We are very happy to have a very interesting topic being presented by researchers from the Reserve Bank of India and from the University of from BITS Pilani, Hyderabad. Sorry for that, but this is a subject which has been of interest to many people, and I believe that this is the first paper on the subject of maternity leave and labor market outcomes. So let me welcome Purna Banerjee, Manager Research at Reserve Bank of India. She did her PhD from IGIDR. And the second author of the same paper, Shreya Biswas, also did her PhD from IGIDR. And she is at the Department of Economics and Finance, BITS Pilani, Hyderabad. Purna Banerjee works on trade, gender, and labor, and Shreya works on household finance, corporate governance, public policy, and applied econometrics. Authors may correct me if I'm wrong. I've taken this from publicly available information. The third author, Debojyoti Mazumder, is not currently on this show, but he is the third author. He is also manager research at Reserve Bank of India. And he's also connected with IGIDR. He was a visiting assistant professor at IGIDR for a short while. So all three authors seem to be connected with IGIDR, and two of them as managers research in Reserve Bank of India. We also have, so we're welcome to the show. Very warm welcome to both of you, Purna and Shreya. And we have a very interesting discussant in the room today, Mitali Nikore. Mitali Nikore is the founder of a youth-led research group called Nikore Associates. Mitali is an advisor, consultant to the best of institutions all over the globe, including Asian Development Bank, United Nations, the World Bank, EY, PwC, and the works. So this is a very interesting show today, where we have two researchers presenting a paper written by three people from Reserve Bank of India and the University of Hyderabad, BITS Pilani, Hyderabad. And we have Mitali from a very different segment of society to discuss this paper. So I think this is going to be a very, very interesting show. So may I invite Purna to start her presentation. And 1 minute, before we do that, sorry for this, but I'd like to say this is the 22nd webinar. We have the 23rd and 24th webinars already lined up, as you can see on the screen. On 27th October, we have a webinar on financial inclusion and household welfare by Manisha Chakrabarti and Subhankar Banerjee. And on 3rd November, we have Does Co-residents and parents-in-law reduce women's employment in India? So there's a lot of data around gender and labor markets emanating from the CPHS database. So I would welcome all of you to join these two webinars as well, and many more that will keep coming up in the future. So now may I invite Purna and Shreya to kindly present that.
I'll just quickly share my screen and
Before you begin, Purna,
sure.
May I also request the participants to feel free to put in their questions in the Q&A box, and the authors will answer them in real time or at the end of the show as they may like. Sorry.
Fine, absolutely. So good evening, everyone, and thank you. We have a lot of people listening in. So thank you for coming and thank you for listening. Please feel free to ask us anything and more importantly, give us your suggestions so that we can work on this. So as Mahesh was telling you, this is a paper titled Maternity Leave and Labor Market Outcomes. It's worked with Shreya and Debojyoti. Debojyoti is also at the Reserve Bank and Shreya is at BITS. So without much introduction, let's just get into what this paper is about and what we are doing. But before, just a small caveat before I start, the standard disclaimer applies, which is that these are our opinions and they don't reflect those of the Reserve Bank of India. So let's start at the very beginning, which is usually a good place to start, which is that everybody knows, this is a fact, universally acknowledged, that women's labor market participation is lower than men's. Labor market participation, not only participation, but just labor market outcomes in general of women, that is their employment, their wages, their job growth prospects, their continuity in the workforce, all of which are lower than their male counterparts. And while this fact is well acknowledged, the reasons are not as well understood in the sense that a lot of people, both academics and policymakers, want to answer this question as to why, but really it still continues to be an open question, given that the nature of these differences are very different across countries and they keep changing. So the work on this remains really an open question. And there are a lot of studies, largely empirical, which try to explain why this is so. Why is it that women's labor market outcomes are worse? And at least in the context of India, most of those studies happen to be supply side analysis, in that they look at filial factors or social factors or social demographic or cultural factors that can explain why women participate less, why women are employed less, why women earn less in India. Or usually the institutions aspect that is looked at is in terms of filial or social institutions. There is now some literature on the demand side as well, that looks at whether say trade matters for women's participation, or whether supply side factors can alone explain the wide gap that we are seeing. And so some demand side analysis is also started, and all of these are largely empirical, which always tries to look at some cause which affects women's employment in India, or women's employment, differences in general. The thing is, where we want to start is there anything fundamental going on in terms of gender differences that drives this wedge between male and female labor market outcomes? And in search of those underlying factors, we have to acknowledge that the one significant way in which men and women partake in the labor market differently is the fact that during the work life or during the potential work life, women experience a maternity shock, which men do not. And the fact this fundamental and natural reality, the fact that women experience a maternity shock, would be driving a large part of the differences that men and women experience in terms of their labor market dynamics or labor market outcomes. Now, this maternity shock that we're talking about is obviously true of, is more true of women in the high fertility age group, right? So women in a particular age group are likely to have to exit the workforce because of maternity and related filial duties, and then either re-enter or not, depending on circumstance or depending on their choice, which is something usually men don't have to, or at least it is perceived that men don't have to. And why the labor market literature, the larger macro labor literature, while they do have started now looking at this age-differentiated labor market flows in life cycle settings. So in research literature, there is a lot of work that looks at age and life cycle settings of search and matching. People look at this issue. But interestingly, and actually some worker heterogeneity is also modeled in those cases, but interestingly, gender is not yet been studied in that literature. Even though In terms of age differentiated labor market outcomes, we would assume that worker heterogeneity in terms of gender is actually a very key and fundamental reality. And that's where we are trying to pitch our work. But when it comes to maternity shock and women's labor market outcomes, or at least largely across the world, policy in most countries has acknowledged this, that this is the fundamental, this could be one of the fundamental or real reasons why women have poorer labor market outcomes, both employment and wages. And why I say this is because in most countries, this acknowledgement has been manifested as different forms of maternity leave. And there are a lot of empirical studies, particularly in the context of welfare states, that have tried to establish whether these policies have any effect on women's labor market outcomes. And of course, there's a lot of work on studying whether maternity leave policies affect other outcomes, so, child development outcomes or women's health outcomes. Surely that literature also exists. But there's also some work that looks at whether or not these leave policies have affected women's labor market outcomes in the short term or the long term, those kinds of things. But the point is the results are really not conclusive and they vary a lot across countries. It's also important to remember that most of those studies are in the developed country context. There are very few developing country studies. There's one recently in world development a couple of years back on Colombia and some others in a cross-country setting. But most of those studies are in the developed country context, which is also something that, that we're trying to protect. But what is important to remember is that these results will probably continue to remain inconclusive empirically in many cases, because the nature of these leaves or nature of maternity benefits vary widely across countries. So first of all, the sectoral definition varies. Secondly, duration varies. Then the very nature of the policy may itself be different in the sense that some are just job protection, some are job protection with wages, some are fully funded by the government, some are fully funded by the employer, in some cases there is some sharing. So given that the nature of the policies are different and countries are also different, so it is likely that these results, it will always be also an open empirical question. So given this background, what we want to do in this paper is try to come into all of these questions of these areas that I was just highlighting. So what we first do in this paper is we start out with a microeconometric evidence using individual level panel data from the consumer pyramids on employment and wages, and to see whether maternity leave benefits have any effect on women's labor market outcomes. The question then is why, if we are trying to answer this fundamental question, then why have we chosen India as the country? And there are two specific reasons for that. One is that, of course, it's needless to say, this specific question hasn't been looked at in the Indian context before. But why it's important in the Indian context is that India has had poorer labor market outcomes, labor force participation, employment, wages. All of this in India is poorer than men for a very long time. And it is interestingly much lower than most of India's economic peers. So the question is what's going on? The question of what's going on in India's labor market that women experience this is very important, is something that we feel. And if we can answer this question from a fundamental place, then I think we're making an important contribution. But also interestingly, India, unlike most of the other welfare states for which these empirical studies have been done, in India, the maternity leave policies are of nature that the employer bears 100% of the cost of this policy. So I'll talk about what India's policy is, but the fact that in India, when maternity leave is going to affect women's labor market outcomes, there are some demand side factors that will come into play, because the employer is facing not only someone leaving the job and having to protect their job, they're also facing an additional cost shock, because they have to bear the cost of this person not being in the workforce, rather not working for them. So we look at this empirical evidence using disaggregated microeconometric and individual level data. And then what we do is then we move on to a theoretical model that we present in the life cycle framework using search matching frictions to explain these differences. So there's microeconometric evidence, there is a micro-founded theory model, and then finally using macroeconomic data for India, we also simulate our model findings with a numerical example. Okay. So this is what we are doing, and this is basically the structure also of the presentation. So here is some policy background. Now, India has had a maternity benefit act or maternity benefit policy since 1961, which is actually quite remarkable, which a lot of countries who are very advanced, as you might know, don't have still. And India has had this for a very long time. In 2000, so under the original Maternity Benefit Act, what women had was 12 weeks of maternity leave, so roughly 3 months. And the provision of the Maternity Benefit Act was that employers cannot fire, first of all, they cannot fire women because they take leave because of maternity. They cannot ask employees to work during the 6 weeks following childbirth. And during maternity leave, women was entitled to receive an average daily wage. The average daily wage was based on the average wage they received before they went on maternity leave. But unlike many countries like Canada, Japan, United Kingdom, in India's case, the cost of not only protecting the job, but also paying this wage is entirely borne by the employer, where the woman was employed before she went on leave. Now, but as some of you might already know, there is a lot of evidence to show that 3 months is not really sufficient maternity leave, both for childcare and postnatal stages. And in order to improve the quality of postnatal care in the months following childbirth, what was done in 2017 was this Maternity Benefit Act was extended. So it was extended from first, so some of the extension provisions are, it was extended from 12 weeks to 26 weeks for new mothers for the first 2 childbirths. It also stipulated that establishments that have more than 50 or more female employees, they have to set up in-premises creche facilities. And this act was implemented, it was passed in 2016, it was implemented from April 2017 pan-India. This is a central government act that has been adopted across states. Now, this exogenous policy extension is what we use as, we rely on this for our identification strategy. So we want to see whether this extension in maternity benefits affected women's labor market outcomes. But which women? So essentially, we are moving into a DID framework. So the question is, this is the reform pre and post which we look at outcomes. But the question is, who is our treatment group? Who does this policy apply to? Clearly, there is no geographical variation. This is a centrally mandated act. So what we want to rely on is going back to what we started with, what I was saying at the outset, which is that what matters here, what matters in this case, or with regard to maternity leave policies, is the perception that women in a certain age group will avail of this leave, right? And who are those women who are likely or likely to be perceived to avail of this leave? It's women in what we can now start calling, or in this paper we start calling, the high fertility age group. Now, how do I know what is the high fertility age group? So we look at, of course, everybody has some broad idea, but this is the NFHS trends over time. And we look at, and if you see that between the 24-20 to 24-25 to 29 group, across rounds of NFHS, they show the highest fertility rates. So looking at these fertility trends, we decide, or we choose women in the high fertility age group as our treatment group, and everybody else in the workforce. So everybody else between 15 and 64. So that is women not in the high fertility age group and males as our control group, right? So now next. This is basically what I was saying. So we focus on the working age population. So our treated group is high fertility women. Control group is everybody else in the workforce, where workforce is 15 to 65. And because this policy really applies to people in the formal sector, we restrict ourselves to the urban sector. We don't go into the rural sector because obviously this doesn't apply to agriculture. And having said all of that, now we move into our specification. So this is our baseline specification where you have labor market outcomes, say employment, depends on reform, which is the implementation of the act, which we define to be one post-reform. So after wave, so in the CPH's language, from wave, after wave one, so from wave 2 of 2017 is when we we start our reform period. So all waves after that, up until the wave 1 of 2020 is the treated group is the high fertility age group women. And it's beta 3, the coefficient that we're interested in, because that is likely, that is going to give us the effect of the reform on labor market outcomes of high fertility age women, right? So in the case of employment, it's a 0-1 variable on the left-hand side. So we run logic regressions. In the case, we also run similar regressions for wages, but wages is along the intensive margin. So we only take women who have been employed, who are employed, to see their wages and how reform affects their wages. So wages is of course along the intensive margin. And then of course we have a whole set of individual and household level controls. In the wage regressions, we also have individual level fixed effects and of course time fixed effects. But for beta 3 to give us what we are looking for, to give us the effect of the reform on the treated, we have to ensure that parallel trends work. And for that, what we do is, so basically we have to show that it is this reform that is driving whatever effect on labor market outcomes that we're seeing and not anything else. What we do is we define a pseudo reform period in the pre-extension era. So what we do is we take 2016 wave 3, 2017 wave 1 as a reform period, and periods before that as pre-reform, and run a pseudo-reform falsification test. And what we essentially want to see is the beta 3 in the falsification test. We want to see it to be statistical, sorry, not beta 3, beta 1 in this case, pseudo-reform beta 1 in this falsification to be statistically insignificant. That would tell us that it is this reform that we are talking about throwing up our results. Also just quickly, sorry, I just want to go back quickly and tell you that in the baseline regression, beta 2 is also of interest, because if the whole story that we have been saying in the beginning, which is that women in the high fertility age group anyway are discriminated in the workforce because, or anyway likely to not be employed much because of natural realities, then beta 2 should also be of interest to us. And we'll come back to this in our theory section as well. It's just something I want to say. So what happens to women in the high fertility age group, just with or without the reform, it's also interesting. And before we go into the econometric results, some quick summary statistics. So this figure gives age-wise female employment in the pre and post-reform era. So the darker line is post-reform, and as you can see, in the post-reform period, only in the fertile age group is women's proportion of employed below that in the pre-reform period. That happens only in the post-reform period. It happens only for the fertile age group. So this gives us some kind of idea that the story that we're pushing, which is that reform is affecting women in a particular age group in this high fertility age, is actually probably true. We also look at the same thing in another way, but just now with both with the control and the group. And if you can see, the darker line is females in the high fertility age group, so our treatment group, and the other line is of course the control group. And as you can see, at reform, there is a fall in female in the high fertility age groups employment probability, and that is not true really for the others. Right? So this is of course person. Now moving on to results. So the coefficient that we're interested in is treated into reform, and as you can see, let's look at say 2 and 4, columns 2 and 4, and as you can see that reform has had a negative effect on both employment probabilities and wages along the intensive margin for women in the high fertility age group. So this is just baseline results. The regressions, so 2 and 4 have all the covariates also that are mentioned below. Right. Now, as I was mentioning, we look at it for the urban sector initially, but we also, just for a quick check, also look at it using both urban and rural sectors, just in case there are some formal sector, there's some formal sector employment even in rural areas, and so we don't want to miss out on that. And the results, of course, still go through that. It doesn't seem to matter. But so one issue that can come up is that, as I have been repeatedly saying, this is a law that only applies to the formal sector. So when you look at everybody's employment, are you conflating some results? Are you looking at the wrong thing? But this is individual level data, so we don't know the characteristics of the individual's employer, which is necessary for the formal sector. But we are looking at, but we tried using this data itself, we are trying to create some kind of proxy for the formal sector. So as some of you might know, the consumer pyramids provides information both on industry of occupation as well as nature of occupation. And using these classifications, we create a dummy for an individual being in the formal sector. And then for people who in the pre-reform era were in the formal sector, in above median formal, so formal employment basically is what, so an individual is characterized as being in formal employment. And then for people in sectors that have above median below formal formality and below median formality, we do subsample analysis. So we find out that median formality, industry-wise, basically, we look at the formality intensity, and then we classify them as above and below median, and then run subsample analysis, and we find that what we are guessing is true, which is that this effect of reform, that is effect of the maternity benefit extension, is true only in high formality sectors and not true in low formality sectors, right? So that is columns 1 and 2 in this table. So that's one check that we have also done. We also do some other quick checks in terms of alternate control groups. So we have we only use high fertility males as the control group, which is, so we're comparing 18 to 28 women with 18 to 28 men. So we want to be sure that the result that we are getting is invariant to the control group that we are choosing, that we're not picking and choosing the control group. Treated group, of course, remains 18 to 28 women. And we also take low fertility females, the argument that I was originally making, which is that this effect is only true for women in a particular age group and not really true afterwards. And we find that if you look at column 3, so of course, with just quickly for columns 1 and 2, let's discuss that, which is that the effect of reform on both employment and income along the intensive margin is negative for high fertility females, even when compared with only high fertility males, that is to be expected. Interestingly, when you look at the effect of the reform for women in the high fertility age group against other women, we find that the reform still has a negative effect on high fertility age women's employment, but not really their wages. And this is actually something that's interesting. So along the intensive margin, we don't find that reform is affected wages of women relative to other women, but it certainly has. But further to convince you that we have what we are saying we are looking at the pseudo reform, which I just to remind you is where reform is defined to be extension of maternity benefit in wave 3 of 2016 and wave 1 of 2017, which is when the actual law was not in place, and years before that as waves before that as pre-reform. And we find that on employment and income, it has no, pseudo-reform has no effect for the treated group. Column 3, of course, throws up a significant result, but that doesn't have the covariance. Once we have the covariance, it's true. That it's statistically insignificant. Pseudo-reform has no effect on the outcomes for the hyperactivity. So hoping with this that we convince you that extension of maternity benefit has in fact had a negative effect on the ages of infertility in women. We also provide some additional results where we look at some heterogeneity, some group heterogeneity. And what we do is we look at high fertility age females across education, the effect of reform across education groups. So we look at the no education, the secondary education, and university, first university degree groups. We find that in all of these groups, they experience in the reform period, they experience lower employment probabilities compared to the group which is the highest education category. And then the negative effect of the amendment on wages of employed females in the high fertility group is seen for all education. So we find that in education when it comes to sorry, there was a question. I just so actually just a question. Can I come back to this later? So it's on measure employment is are you employed or not, and of course, it does fall around childbirth, but that's possible. But on average, of course, we are controlling for individual characteristics. Okay, Shreya is there. So the duration is not something. Sorry. So of course, there's education where we're looking at the heterogeneity. We also look at skill intensity of occupation. So we again using CBHS data, we define industries. We look at skill as the proportion. Skill intensity is defined as the proportion of graduates in a given occupation according to this CBHS database in the pre-reform period, so 2016-23. And then we see the negative effect of reform on employment of the treated group has, so if we then divide it in quartiles of skill intensity, and we find that this negative effect of reform on employment that we are seeing is driven by the third quartile of skill intensity and not the others. Sorry, just one second. Then we move on to, so this is basically some heterogeneity also that we are looking at. Now, let me just check. Okay, so I've taken 35 minutes to do this. I'll quickly drive you through what we are doing in the macro model. This is a search and matching friction model. That is, it's kind of standard in the heterogeneous framework. So, but here our types are male and female. And the only way male and females are different is that males do not experience a maternity shock, but female workers do. And they do so in a particular range of their work life. Where, of course, and it's important to remember that in the model, this is the only heterogeneity across males and females that we are considering. So and why this is important, one way, if you think that they are different in so many other ways, but why this is valuable is that just with this heterogeneity and keeping everything else the same, we still have a result that shows that women in the high fertility age group experience poorer labor market outcomes, and that reforms such as the one in India So I'll just quickly answer that question. Why is the number in employment so low? Because it needs to change, right? The employment status over periods, it needs to change across the rates for the estimation. So we need those observations for women who have been in and out. Anyway, so just going back to this, so this is with this heterogeneity also we see our results going through. So if you tell me that they're different in many other ways, it's just going to make the results make it so that the differences are wider, not smaller. Okay, next. Just quickly, so you have two types of agents, male and female. They start their work life at I as unemployed and they end it at capital T. There's an exogenous retirement age at T+1. The retiring generation is replaced by a new generation of the same size, so there's no population growth and no change in the general distribution. Now, Chi is the proportion that represents male, 1 minus Chi is female, and we scale into unit population size. Each worker discovers a productivity epsilon at each period from a distribution G, and the workers in firms face diamond, Morton's implicit rates, diamond search, and matching friction. I'll show you the matching function in a second. And by assumption, the search process is not allowed to be directed based on gender or age. Now, the interesting thing in this model that we're doing is that there are workers, agents who experience a maternity shock and rejoin the labor market after S periods. If the agent is female and belongs to the fertile age group, then this is where, as you can see, so T1 to T1 plus delta minus 1 is where they are, is the fertile age group, is when they can experience the maternity shock, and they experience this with a probability 1 minus lambda, and they leave the labor market. Once they experience the shock, anywhere between T1 and T1 plus delta minus 1, they leave the workforce for experience and come back after. Unemployed workers of age I minus 1, they match with a vacant job at age I. This is the matching function, which is standard in vacancies and unemployed workers. It's increasing and concave in both. And the CRS, there is an idiosyncratic productivity epsilon prime that is realized from G. And of course, as a standard here, if the agent's realized productivity is lower than the endogenous reservation productivity, jobs remain endogenous. So this is endogenous job description. This is the basic timeline. So when we are entering, of course, some experience a maternity shock, there is a matching that's going to take place after we come back. Then there is reciprocal job destruction as a standard, and then of course unemployment status production is after the match. So this is again what I'll not do. Let's not get into this too much. What I'll quickly tell you is that if you look at this, so females, this is the unemployment rate dynamics. And the important thing to note here is that it is different in, it is, so the first line, as you can see, is from 1 to T minus 2 before they enter the labor market, before they enter, sorry, the fertile age. Then you have this period when they're in the fertile age and have left the labor market and are about to leave the labor market. In the fertile age groups, T1 plus S minus 2. Sorry, they've left the labor market and then come back. And then there's after that, T1 plus S after they've come back. So, and then the last line is, of course, after that, after the fertile age is over, so after T1 plus. So this is how you write down the unemployment dynamics for females. So total unemployment rate is this. Multiply the male unemployment with the problem with the Chi, which is the proportion of males. And then you have the expected value of the vacant firm, which differs for different types of agents. So the first part is, this is for everyone, and the second part is when they have women in the fertile age group. And then, so this is the first slide. So this is the value function for firms. So that's been done. So here also, as you can see in these equations, if you just go to the bottom, the jobs filled by female workers. So the value function for firms where jobs are filled, where matching takes place with female workers, they differ because they now have some employees who may avail of the maternity benefit, or rather not maternity benefit, who may avail of experience a maternity shock. That's it. Once they experience a maternity shock, whether or not there is any benefit, they will have to leave the firm, right? So this is in the no policy era. We are still in the no policy era, and we find that these are worker value functions. Again, if you look at the second, the male one is standard, and that is replicable below as well. For not in the age group, for those who are, it looks slightly different, right? That's that. So these are standard assumptions, that there's free entry, that productivity is below Rij, that the firm uses incentive to continue with the same match, and so jobs grade, and that wages are determined by Nash Barber. And then this is so this is, as you can see, it's stuff, the definition is just basically the stuff that I have set out so far, and the result shows that the reservation productivity for female workers who are not currently under the maternity shock but belongs to this fertile age group becomes higher than the rest of the workforce, which leads to lesser wages and higher employment. So that is in the situation where there is no policy yet. What happens is now we introduce a policy in this area where no firm can fire a female worker who receives the maternity shock. So not only has your worker left your firm, so the value function changes, but you also have to hold on to their job. So when they come back, there is no matching. When they re-enter the workforce, no matching is going to happen because they automatically match to the job that they already had. The value fraction of different firms who hire female workers, and they change because even if the production unit associated with the female worker, they can't produce, the firm has to continue to pay the can't produce, meaning they've not replaced this person. The firm has to continue the wages that they have earned earlier. And the female worker who has received the maternity shock remains employed when she comes back to the production process. So the unemployment pool is not affected by 1 minus lambda. That's the proportion of women who are leaving at every period. Right? The notion of free entry, reservation productivity, and the definition of equilibrium are the same. And our result shows that the wage and employment scenario of female workers in this fertile age group can actually now become much worse. It's a little easier to look at it if you look at these simulation results. So the first one is reservation productivity. Now look at unemployment. Unemployment, this is without policy. This is when there is no policy. You just see that in the fertile age group, unemployment goes up, share of the surplus comes down, wages come down. If there is policy of the type that we have described, where the employer bears the entire costs, these just become worse. So unemployment becomes worse, share of surplus becomes worse, and wages become worse. According to our numerical example. So the numerical example, we have some parameters from literature, but whose parameters are fertility and leave duration and stuff from the Indian macro, both the LFS and NFH. So, what we have done so far in this paper is, we provide empirical and theoretical analysis to provide evidence that women in the high fertility age group experience adverse effects in the labor market that are exacerbated in the presence of mandated maternity leave policies. Now, the thing is, in the Indian context, this low engagement of women in the workforce is quite peculiar considering its economic peers. But the question is, can this then shed some light on that? And a lot of studies have tried to understand the Indian case, and they tried to understand even largely across the world why women participate less in the workforce, why women, what can be done to make women's economic engagement better. And what we want to say based on our analysis is that, a lot of the time there's a lot of policy focus and work that wants to make it better for women that can have unintended consequences. And the natural reality that women face some differences in the labor market due to community realities is the motherhood penalty is of course true. But what we show is that policies that aim to make it better, such as maternity benefits, may not do so if the policy is not well designed, if the costs of the policy or the cost burden of the policy is not understood well. This is not to say that these policies are wrong or the Maternity Benefit Act should not exist or maternity benefit policies should not exist. They certainly should exist, and such mandated policies is really the bare minimum that needs to be done for providing women some welfare benefits in the workforce. But the point is policy design needs to be better. it needs to understand that while the benefits are well understood of maternity leave in terms of developmental outcomes of children, and in India it's true, development outcomes of children has improved. Such as data. Um, some things have certainly improved, and we still have a long way to go. So these policies are much needed, but they need to be better understood and better designed. And if you are going to force employers to bear 100% of the cost, it is in a world where efficiency has some value. It's unlikely to have very positive effects on women's labor market outcomes, particularly from the demand side. We want to come back to the work, but the question is, or women may want to continue to start working, but employers will have to ask this question: if the person is likely to be in this graduate group, do I hire them now, or do I just hire everybody else? So with that, I will stop. I'll just quickly check if there are some pending questions. No, there aren't. And I'm happy to take any questions. Please go ahead. Should I stop sharing?
Yes, maybe Purna, you can stop sharing for now.
Okay, and if there's a question, yeah, sure.
Unless a question turns up later. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation with striking results. I don't think I will waste any time before inviting Mitali to comment on your paper. Over to you, Mitali.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. So I hope my screen is visible to everybody. And, I think, Purna, this has just been such an interesting read for me, because it's almost feeling like an I told you so moment for me at this point, because to be very honest, I mean, when this policy came out, again, I'm not an academic, but I am a commentator, someone who can't keep her opinions to herself kind of a person. And I wrote a blog in 2017 itself, where actually, essentially I talked about a very similar prediction, so if you will, and absolutely just loving the fact that it's like the prediction has come true, but also feeling bittersweet because it's not exactly the kind of outcome one would hope for when one is talking about female labor force participation in India and in the context of the maternity leave policy. So I think today I just want to talk about 2 or 3 things, which is, of course, understand the key takeaways of the paper and discuss those in greater depth, but also supplement the inferences with some of our research that we've been doing at Nikore Associates, particularly talking to a lot of corporates and women and their reactions to this policy. How have they been in the last 3 or 4 years? And, also discuss some best practices of parental leave policies. Notice how I'm, changing the wording already from maternity to parental leave, and what implications this could have for policy design in India. So we'll start off, of course, with, what we always start off with, the decline in female labor force participation. So here I've used data from the NSSO to sort of chart out a long-term time series of labor force participation for the working age group. And we can see that, year 2011 and then 2017, but also, between 2004 to 2009 are 2 or 3 inflection points. We can clearly see a big drop in the female labor force participation, first in 2004 to 2009, and then hitting the nadir in 2017. And it's been a little bit of a rise in the last 3 or 4 years. In fact, I also wrote a piece on, I have a paper on this, but also wrote a piece on how this increase that we're seeing in 2020, 2021 is actually symptomatic of poor quality of employment in the last 1 year because of the pandemic. But I think if we just break this down a little bit further, we can see that, the decline in female labor force participation in the last 1 or 2 decades, which is the most pronounced, has actually happened much more in rural areas as opposed to urban areas. And I think that links very interestingly with our paper, because our paper really talks about the maternity shock and then, of course, the impact of this amendment, which, of course, would be felt much more by workers in the organized sector in urban areas. And we can already see that, it's actually, when we look at this conundrum of labor force participation, it always is puzzling. There are 4 or 5 factors like occupational segregation, the increasing mechanization of agriculture, of course, unpaid work and care responsibilities, mobility restrictions, social norms around what kind of job you can do or cannot do if you're a woman. So a lot of these factors, and of course, gender gaps in education and skill training, particularly where, acting as a deterrent to women's entry into manufacturing sector. So a lot of these factors exist. So I think it's interesting that we're zooming in on the Maternity Act and the amendment. Now, sorry. Yeah. So now in terms of the paper, just coming back to the paper, as I said, it's a phenomenal paper to read because a lot of the predictions that people, commentators like myself, were making on the policy advocacy side, this paper really gives us the academic proof, if you will, to say that, this is actually happening. We must look at the data, and the data is actually bearing a lot of these issues out around the motherhood penalty, around maternity shocks. And this is, in fact, a very interesting analysis because the paper very effectively uses the Indian policy as almost like a natural experiment to say that, this is the one country amongst many countries which has this policy, it's introduced this policy. So is it actually impacting those who are in the high fertility age group? And of course, the paper spotlights the demand side constraints, which again is very innovative and different compared to most of the narratives around maternity leaves and around labor market barriers, which really focus much more on the supply side, especially in terms of the fact that the time use data has just come out. We, in 2019, so we are all still, I'm writing a paper right now, which is just looking at the different, meaning and different cuts of the time use data, looking at different state level narratives coming out from the time use data. And it's very interesting that at this time we look at the demand side constraints, because the time use data really gives us much more of a supply side narrative as well, which is coming out from NSO. And I think it's the first time that this paper really makes it okay to say that maternity leaves, while important, are not effective by themselves, as a sole policy instrument for retention of women in the workforce. I'm not even saying that this is an instrument for, encouraging entry into the workforce, but most importantly, retention, because it is well known that it's the first, or the second significant milestone in a woman's personal life, and has also been documented to have a cliff effect. When we look at the literature coming out from McKinsey or, research coming out from a lot of companies like PwC, they are all talking about the fact that marriage is the first cliff effect, but the first child actually brings out, a much sharper fall in their employees. And so this is just something that I also wanted to highlight. Of course, we've talked about the amendment, but the implications of the amendment and what are the impacts of the amendment really, because we've increased the entitlement from 12 to 26 weeks, which is effectively 6 months. And the entire cost of these facilities is to be borne by the employer, making India one of the only countries in the world with such a long maternity leave, no parental leave per se, and then the entire cost being borne by employers. So the incentives, as we know and we've seen from this paper, get thoroughly misaligned. And even after these 26 weeks, and this is something which is there in the policy, but we're seeing it now. We're doing actually a study with Zoom and Gates Foundation on the impact of working from home on female labor force participation. And even there, we're realizing that a lot of women are continuing to, work from home even after rejoining work, and that itself has an impact on their promotions, on their retention, on their interest in staying back versus dropping out of the workforce. So there's a number of complex factors which are there in this decision, but the issue is that only women who are allowed to work from home after their maternity experience, but there is absolutely no discussion of men working from home to take care of the child at any point in this entire policy. So I think the negative impacts really, in my view at least, outweigh the positives, which is what I pointed out even when I wrote my opinion piece, which is that it reinforces these gender stereotypes that childcare is solely a woman's responsibility. And of course, there's an imbalance in terms of the cost of hiring both men and women. And I think that is something where, really the implications of the amendment and this cost differential, the kind of evidence that we're getting from the paper is very convincing and very much in line with the expectations from commentators like myself and also from industry. So, just to reiterate some of these findings, that women in the high fertility group, however we may define that fertility group, being less likely to be employed, average wages being lower in the post-reform period is almost incontrovertible evidence that there is a disincentive towards hiring younger and younger women. And what this also kind of implies for the future is that if you don't create women in this 18 to 28 age group in the entry level, then how are you going to create more and more women in the senior management or the leadership levels? And then, of course, the higher cost of hiring a woman in the high fertility group is the main deterrent. So what is the implication of this for future gender wage gaps? If I look at the data today from PLFS, the gender wage gaps are somewhere between 63%, 64% for casual categories, and going down to 80%. So a woman's wage being 80% of a male wage for the regular categories. So, but if this higher cost continues to exist, then what does this really mean in the future for women's take-home salary wages? As we can see from these blocks, will the salary block for females have to fall down for these two levels of benefits to equalize at some point in the long run, is something that we need to think about as we research this topic further. And of course, the negative effects being more pronounced for those in high-skilled occupations or with higher education, it's a very logical result, because when we look at the actual implementation of this policy, it only covers 10% of the workforce, which is in the organized sector. Those who are working without contracts, those who are working in the unorganized spaces in primarily rural areas may not be covered by this benefit. In fact, the one benefit that they are getting is probably the cash transfer from the Matri Vandana Yojana. So I think we really have to think about this dual structure that started to emerge, where organized sector maternity benefits are much, much higher than what an unorganized person is getting, and also that they are actually being delivered, unlike in the unorganized space, even though the law is technically for everybody. There's also an interesting survey that I wanted to bring out in front of everyone today, which was done by Team Leads in 2018-19 with about I think 200, 255 enterprises. And they actually estimated that because of this amendment, there would be a net job loss of between 1.1 to 1.8 million in the year 2018-19. Of course, it remains to be seen whether that actually happened, and we will have to study both the CMI and PLFS data to really know whether this bore true, but at least that was the prediction at that point. So it would be interesting to study that. Another important study I wanted to talk about was done by the IFC, which talks about the creches provision. So I think today in the paper we didn't discuss so much about creches, but actually the amendment requires that employers should set up creches, and of course the cost of this is also to be borne by the employers. And the interesting thing is that the law only requires women to have the right to visit their children in the creche 4 times a day. But if men use the creche, then legally they are not entitled to visit the creche. And I don't even know if, again, we need to have more research on this to see how many men are actually availing of creche facilities in their organizations. But when a survey was done by the IFC in 2018 of, again, over 250 enterprises, even though 80%, nearly 80% of employers agree that yes, this is a great step for gender equality in the workforce, on principle, I'm sure everyone agrees. But when it came to the implementation, almost 46% said that it was either moderately or very challenging to comply with this creche provision. They wanted some guidelines to actually set up the creches and what this would mean for their organization and how that creche facility was supposed to set up. And in fact, almost a fifth of the companies were even yet to consider setting up these creche facilities. And in fact, Shreya Raman from the India Spend team recently tried to update this survey, and she found that the results were quite similar even to 2018. So in the last 4-5 years, we actually haven't seen much of a movement towards setting up these creches and actually implementing many of the provisions that are enshrined in the Act. Now, other implications of this amendment, which can of course be future areas for study, I mean, points that I actually did point out in my op-ed piece even at that time. Of course, the fall in demand we are already starting to see in this research, and the reduction in upfront salary also we are starting to see it in this paper. But I think the interesting thing would be to study increase in contractual employment, even for men, maybe. It's an excuse in a sense that even those organizations which are operating in the formal sector, do they start offering more and more contract-based work and gig type work for skilled persons as well, just to avoid these statutory obligations. And when it comes to consultations done by Nikore Associates, we are definitely finding this to be the case, with the companies and women that we've been talking to over the last 3 years. And then in terms of the increase in informal employment, that is also a potential fallout, especially in the construction, agriculture, labor sector. Instead of moving towards a formalization of employment, we see that will we see an increase in informal employment just owing to this amendment? I think these are 2 important questions for us to think about and consider as we move forward. Of course, the paper also makes important contributions towards the policy prescription for the design that, parental leave policies, of course, should be more equitable. And this is exactly what a lot of commentators are also saying. And appropriate compensation should be provided to the firms, because otherwise there is that disincentive which continues. And if we just compare the Indian, sort of quantum of maternity leave with some of the most advanced countries on this, we can see that India is actually much higher, almost comparable to Finland when it comes to number of days of maternity leave, but then, shared and parental leave is absent in the Indian case. And this is even the case when we compare it with many of the BRICS countries. In fact, Russia being one of the leaders in the BRICS, economies where it's offering a high, portion of shared parental leave. But basically, if we look at a potential, configuration, Finland provides an interesting, example where they recently actually brought in their reforms. So that's why I'm highlighting Finland, which is that earlier they used to have a very flexible policy where, maternity leave was around 105 work days, paternity was 54, and then they had the flexible shared leave of 158 work days. But this kind of led to a lot of fathers not using the shared parental leave, and that would just be opted for by the women. In fact, 90% of all parental leave days were going to women. And this actually resulted in a fall in the fertility rate from 1.87 to 1.35 over the last decade. And, it was felt that there is a need for reforms. Also, the number of mothers with small children was growing in the ranks of those that are employed. So now the new policy has come in Finland where the maternity leave and paternity leave has been made equal at 160 days, and this is mandatory. And on top of that, the pregnant parent is entitled to 40 additional days of pregnancy allowance. Parents can shift around a maximum of 63 days between themselves. So there's still some, flexibility in the policy, but I think the basic change is the increase in the compulsory paternity leave that's been, brought in Finland, which is a very interesting example. May not necessarily work in India at this point in history where we stand today, given the social norms, but interesting example for us to learn from. So just a few policy prescriptions, from me towards the end. I think the basic principle that I'd like to emphasize is that the law needs to lead society in recognizing that childcare is not the mother's responsibility alone. I think there is a huge mindset when we listen to policymakers and when we, have these discussions with policymakers that, oh, if you introduce a paternity leave, the man will take the paternity leave and the woman will still be doing all of the work at home. And I mean, fair enough, because if we look at the time use survey data, we know that women are doing 10 times the amount of work, unpaid work in a day as compared to men. And 44% of unpaid work actually goes into childcare. So it's a single largest, chunk of activities under unpaid care work. So it's not unfounded, based on what people are seeing around them. But at the same time, we need to say that the legalese needs to lead, the social norm will follow. Then in terms of what we can propound and advocate for, of course, the first one is around shared parental leave, move away from this concept of just maternity leave and shared parental leave, which can be shared flexibly. Because at this point, if we mandate paternity leave, it may not be opted for, or there may be resistance, at least from the policymaker side. So at least having shared parental leave, which can be determined, the proportion can be determined by the couple. So as a first step. Then, of course, the second one is really around the cost sharing. And I think, that's where a lot of people become a little bit unsure of, who's going to bell the cat and who's really going to bear the cost. So my, advocacy on this point and the point I've always talked about for the last 5 years is that there are two people, at least in a heterogeneous couple. I'm not saying that this would apply in the case of a single mom or a single dad or, a single person of other gender who wants to be a parent, in which case we can have separate set of rules. But given the current, nature of what is a representative family in the Indian context, there are two parents involved, there are two families involved, and the employers of the couple should share the total cost of the parental leave. And it should not be that the employer of the woman, in this case, I'm just saying woman because that's a typically representative scenario, should not be the one bearing the maternity leave cost or the parental leave cost entirely just because the employer happened to hire a woman. That's just discriminatory and is creating disincentives, as we can see. So if this cost of the parental leave can be shared equitably between the employers of the couple, That could be one solution. Of course, a proportionate pay system can also be devised. More, intricate rules can be devised, but this is definitely one option that's there on the table in terms of having a shared cost of the parental leave, so that the disincentive is removed because the man will be the father as well. So then you're just doing away with the gender difference that tilts the scale, in favor of the men when it comes to cost of hiring. And then in terms of government support, I think the government is already conceptualizing the establishment of a maternity benefits fund under the new labor codes. This could be, of course, conceptualized as a parental leave benefits fund and used to compensate at least MSMEs. I'm not saying that, government funding should go towards large corporates who can probably afford it, but at least for MSME sector, which is a big area of, which is a big miss when it comes to full maternity leave benefits, and for whom it is a huge drain at this point. Very honestly, when it comes to our consultations, a lot of MSMEs which are even run by women have said that it's a big drain on resources. So for at least for them, the government support can be given. For startups, this government support can be given from the parental leave benefits fund, and they can cover in either the partial duration with the government support, or cover the entire duration at less than full pay. That can be a way of doing it. A lot of countries are doing it like that. And then at the end of the day, I mean, of course, there's gender neutrality in creche facilities. We don't talk about it enough, but we really should, so that it's a small amendment. It's actually not even got a cost implication, but allowing parents access to creche facilities, in a legal way. If you have a law to allow women to access creche facilities, then that law should equally allow men to access creche facilities in the vicinity of the workplace. So with that, I will, conclude the presentation, but I think open to questions and, reactions from everyone. And a big congratulations to Purna, Shreya, and Debojyoti on this brilliant paper. It's really helped advocates, policy advocates, to quantify the issues that we've been predicting.
Thank you very much, Mitali, for a very nice presentation. You not only commented on the presentation by Purna, but also brought in new dimensions into the discussion regarding maternity leave and its impact on labor market outcomes, and also ended with some prescriptions on what you think can be done to repair the possible damage that these policies have made, apparently. So that's very good. I don't see any questions from the audiences at this point in time. Purna, would you like to come in at this point to respond to what Mitali has said? You're on mute.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for taking time out and reading our work. And a lot of it is, of course, very useful for us. Particularly in terms of motivation, I think we can use a lot of it for rewriting. And thank you for your policy suggestions as well. I think we can have that discussion. If you have, I don't think you have any specific questions. So with regard to the work, so there were some questions in the Q&A, but we've already answered them. We had a few suggestions as well. So
yes, Purna, you have already answered those questions. So you have satisfied the audiences on their questions.
But happy to take any further questions if somebody wants to.
Well, if there are any questions that come to us even after this presentation, we'll be happy to connect them with you, and with you as well, Mitali, if they come to your presentation as well. So thank you everyone for attending this 22nd webinar, and I will end this show for now over here and hope to see you again on other events by us. Like Preetha has put up, there's one coming up on October 27th and yet another one on November 3rd. And as you can see that we have a lot of presentations around women's employment. So Purna, the work that you have done We will keep on working more and more on that. So if you write any more papers, please do send them to us. If you update your current paper, please send them to us. We'll put them up on the website, and would be very happy to popularize your work. Spread it as far as possible. That's our objective. That's the reason why we hold these webinars, is to spread your work and to bring it under critical scrutiny to help you hone it further. So happy to engage further with all of you.
Thank
Till
you
then,
so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And all of you in India, have a good evening.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.